Movies are getting longer, and not in the way people think. If you feel like every blockbuster now demands an entire evening of your life, you're not imagining it. The Hollywood Reporter recently published an article titled, "It's Not Your Imagination, Movies Are Getting Longer," and it lays out the numbers right up front. According to their analysis, the average runtime of wide releases has increased from 106 minutes in 1993 to 114 minutes in 2023. And 32% of wide releases now run over 2 hours, compared to just 14% in the 1980s. The article also notes that action movies now average around 128 minutes. The framing is clear. Movies are longer, and this is simply the new normal. Where I break with the article is in what it does with that information. It leans heavily on the idea that audiences are not only fine with this trend, but actively embracing it. It quotes Denis Villeneuve, who claims young people want meaningful, long movies, and uses the success of films like Oppenheimer as evidence that audiences crave extended runtimes. The implication is that length equals importance, that if a movie is long, it must be meaningful. But the real issue isn't that movies are getting longer. The real issue is that movies are getting longer without getting better. Hollywood has confused epic with exhausting, and the result is a wave of films that feel bloated, padded, and artificially inflated. Not because the story demands it, but because the industry thinks length equals value. And that brings me to the first major point the article completely sidesteps. Ticket prices. When I went to see John Wick back in 2014, the matinee cost me $6. If I'd gone to a 7 p.m. show, it would have been $8 or $9. A movie ticket was basically the cost of a cheap lunch. If the movie wasn't great, you shrugged it off. You didn't feel like you'd made a major financial mistake. Today, I routinely see adult tickets priced at $18 to $20. And here's the kicker. Theaters still have matinee showtimes, but they don't have matinee prices anymore. A matinee is just an earlier version of the same expensive ticket. When a single ticket costs as much as a Blu-ray or a PVOD rental, audiences start doing the math. They want to feel like they're getting their money's worth. Hollywood knows this, so instead of lowering prices, they inflate runtimes to create the illusion of value. Look, it's almost 3 hours, you're getting a lot of movie for that ticket. But here's the irony. The longer movies get, the less likely I am to go to see them. And I'm not alone. That leads straight into the second thing that the article ignores. Sunk cost psychology. A bad 90-minute movie is annoying, but survivable. You wasted an hour and a half, you move on. A bad 3-hour movie feels like a punishment. The longer the movie, the higher the perceived risk. The higher the risk, the more speculative, the more selective people become. And the more selective people become, the more movies they skip entirely. The Hollywood Reporter piece treats runtime like a neutral statistic, not a psychological barrier. Take The Batman, for example. 2022's The Batman, directed by Matt Reeves. I never saw it. Not because I dislike Batman, I actually like Batman, but because the 3-hour runtime made me question whether it was worth the effort. I wasn't rejecting the movie, I was rejecting the time commitment, and I'm far from the only one who felt that way. A lot of people came out of it saying some version of, this could have been a tighter 2-hour movie. That doesn't sound like audiences craving long runtimes. It sounds like audiences tolerating them when they have to. The same thing happened with Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. I skipped it. Not because I'm tired of the franchise, but because the runtime was pushing 3 hours and it was only Part 1. These movies used to be tight, fast, rewatchable 2-hour thrillers. Now they're sprawling, overstuffed, and split into multi-film arcs. That's not storytelling necessity, that's franchise inflation. Then there's No Time to Die. I did watch that one, but I watched it at home on Amazon Prime. And here's what stuck with me. It took about 25 minutes just to get to the title sequence, and James Bond dies at the end. That's it. I don't remember the villain's name, I don't remember the specifics of the plot, I don't remember the stakes beyond, this is the one where Bond dies. The movie evaporated from my brain almost immediately. That's the problem with runtime bloat. It doesn't automatically make a movie more meaningful. It often makes it more forgettable. The longer a movie drags, the more it blurs together. This is where the Hollywood Reporter article really starts to feel selective. It quotes Villeneuve praising long movies and points to Oppenheimer as proof that audiences embrace length, but it never acknowledges that long movies can also fail. It never grapples with the fact that runtime can be a liability. And that brings us to one of the clearest examples of prestige-driven runtime inflation backfiring. Blade Runner 2049. The original Blade Runner from 1982 runs about 117 minutes. It's tight, atmospheric, and dense with subtext. It became a cult classic not because of a convoluted plot, but because of its mood, its world building, and its philosophical undercurrents. Blade Runner 2049, by contrast, runs 163 minutes, nearly 3 hours. Despite critical praise, it underperformed at the box office. Rutger Hauer, who delivered the iconic Tears and Rain monologue in the original and even wrote it himself, said the sequel had no soul. Even Ridley Scott himself has criticized its length. If long runtimes were inherently what audiences wanted, Blade Runner 2049 should have been a slam dunk. It wasn't. And that's not an isolated case. You see the same pattern in Peter Jackson's King Kong. The original King Kong from 1933 is 100 minutes long, which was already on the long side for its time. Most films in the early 1930s were around 75 to 80 minutes, but that 100 minutes is used efficiently. The movie moves, it's focused, it gets in, does what it needs to do, and gets out. It's a model of early blockbuster pacing. Jackson's 2005 remake, on the other hand, runs 187 minutes in its theatrical cut and over 200 minutes in its extended version. He took a simple adventure story and inflated it into a 3-hour epic, and a lot of people, myself included, feel that the length was unnecessary. The movie is packed with extended character introductions, long Skull Island sequences, repeated action beats, and emotional arcs that could have been told more cleanly in far less time. Why did that happen? Context. Peter Jackson had just come off the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Each of those films, especially in their extended editions, runs over 3 hours. There was an expectation from Jackson, from the studio, from audiences, that he was now the epic guy. So when he remade King Kong, it wasn't enough to make a great 2-hour adventure movie. It had to be an event. It had to be huge. It had to feel like another towering award season ready epic. But King Kong is not Lord of the Rings. It's not a sprawling multi-book saga with dozens of characters and intersecting plot lines. It's a Beauty and the Beast adventure that works best when it's lean. The story didn't demand 3 hours. The director's reputation did. And that's a pattern that the Hollywood Reporter article never really confronts. Movies aren't just getting longer because audiences want more story. They're getting longer because the industry has convinced itself that length equals importance, and that audiences will equate more minutes with more value, even when the story doesn't justify it. So when you look at examples like Peter Jackson's King Kong, you start to see a pattern. Hollywood keeps stretching movies not because the stories require it, but because the industry has convinced itself that longer automatically means better. But that's only true when the story actually earns the length. And that's where the conversation needs to shift, away from runtime as a statistic and toward runtime as a storytelling choice. Because some movies really do earn their length. And when they do, audiences don't feel exhausted. They feel immersed. One of the clearest examples of this is Seven Samurai. Akira Kurosawa's 1954 masterpiece runs 3.5 hours, one of the longest mainstream films ever made. And here's the thing, if you wanted to, you could cut entire subplots and characters. You could streamline it, you could make it more efficient, but efficiency doesn't always mean better. The digressions, the side stories, the quiet moments, the character beats, they're the soul of the film. They're what make the village feel alive. They're what make the samurai feel human. They're what make the stakes feel real. And the proof that the plot of Seven Samurai can be told in 2 hours is right there in its knockoffs. The Magnificent Seven from 1960 is 128 minutes long and is considered one of the greatest American westerns ever made. Battle Beyond the Stars from 1980, essentially Seven Samurai in space, is only 104 minutes long and was one of Roger Corman's most commercially successful films. Both movies work, both movies are beloved, both movies are efficient, but they're not Seven Samurai. They don't have the same depth, the same texture, the same emotional resonance. They're great films, but they're not transcendent, and that's the point. Seven Samurai is the exception. Most long movies are not Seven Samurai. Most long movies are long because of bloat, not because of richness. And that brings us to another long movie that absolutely earns its runtime, The Ten Commandments. Cecil DeMille's 1956 biblical epic runs 3 hours and 40 minutes. It is massive, sprawling, and unapologetically grand. But here's the thing. Anyone who grew up in Sunday school knows the story of Moses. They know the beats, they know the plagues, they know the burning bush, they know the Exodus, they know the parting of the Red Sea. They know the tablets. There is an expectation, almost a cultural requirement, that these moments be included. Cutting them would feel incomplete. Cutting them would feel wrong. The length of the Ten Commandments isn't indulgent, it's structural. The story spans decades, nations, miracles, and mythic events. It is remembered as one of the definitive versions of the Moses story precisely because it takes its time. It's long because the story is long. But here's the interesting part. If you ask most people today which version of the Moses story they'd show their kids, they'll probably say 1998's The Prince of Egypt. It's animated, it's accessible, it's emotionally powerful, it's half the length of the Ten Commandments, and hits nearly all the same beats. It even has memorable songs. Deliver Us, All I Ever Wanted, Through Heaven's Eyes, When You Believe. And fun fact, When You Believe won the Academy Award for Best Original Song at the 71st Academy Awards in 1999. It proves the story can be told efficiently, but that doesn't diminish the Ten Commandments. It just shows that some stories can support multiple approaches, one long, one short, and both can work. And it also shows how much the medium has changed. In 1956, you couldn't watch a 4-hour epic on television. Today, if the Ten Commandments were remade shot for shot, it would almost certainly be a prestige TV miniseries, like the 1980 Shogun adaptation or the 1998 Merlin miniseries. Modern audiences don't want to sit in the theater for 4 hours, but they'll binge 6 hours of TV without even blinking. And that brings us to the heart of the runtime debate. Does this movie actually need to be 2.5 to 3 hours? In most cases, the answer is no. Hollywood rarely asks this question anymore. Instead, they assume that longer equals better. But most modern movies don't need to be that long. They're padded with redundant scenes, franchise setups, slow pacing, and part one structures. They're long because the industry wants them to feel like events, not because the story demands it. And that's why the next two examples, Gladiator and Kingdom of Heaven, are so important, because these are long movies that actually earn their length through emotional weight, thematic depth, and storytelling maturity. Let's start with Gladiator. Ridley Scott's 2000 epic runs about 155 minutes. It's long, but it's tight. It's emotional, it's disciplined, and it ends with the kind of bittersweet finality that modern Hollywood would never touch. Maximus kills Commodus in the final duel. He frees Rome from tyranny. He fulfills his promise to Marcus Aurelius. And then he dies from the stab wound Commodus inflicted before the fight. He reunites with his family in the afterlife, but he never gets to enjoy the Rome he liberated. It's complete, it's final, and it's the kind of ending that makes a sequel unnecessary, which is exactly why Gladiator 2 felt unnecessary to so many people. The story was already over. But before we get to that, we need to talk about Kingdom of Heaven, specifically the director's cut. Because this is another long movie that absolutely earns its runtime, and it ends with one of the most misunderstood, bittersweet finales in modern cinema. In the director's cut, even the theatrical version of it, Balian defends Jerusalem against impossible odds, but he realizes that continuing to fight will only lead to mass slaughter. So he negotiates with Saladin, surrender the city in exchange for safe passage for every civilian. Saladin accepts. Balian asks, "What is Jerusalem worth?" Saladin replies, "Nothing. Everything." It's one of the most profound exchanges in Ridley Scott's entire filmography. Balian wasn't protecting the walls, he was protecting the people. And the ending gets even better. After saving thousands of lives, Balian returns to his village and resumes life as a blacksmith. No glory, no throne, no reward, just peace. Then Richard the Lionheart arrives asking how to get to Jerusalem. Balian repeats the advice Godfrey gave him at the start of the film. You go to where the men speak Italian, and then continue until they speak something else. Richard says they took that road to find him, and Balian simply replies, "I am the blacksmith." He refuses to be drawn back into war. It's a mature, bittersweet ending. the kind modern Hollywood avoids because it doesn't leave room for sequels. And that brings us to Gladiator 2, a movie that illustrates the other side of the runtime problem. Not runtime bloat, but narrative redundancy. Because sometimes the issue isn't that a movie is too long. Sometimes the issue is that the movie doesn't need to exist at all. I didn't skip Gladiator 2 because of its runtime. I skipped it because the original Gladiator ended with such emotional finality that there was nowhere left to go. Maximus' story was complete. His arc was closed. His sacrifice meant something precisely because it was final. You can't sequelize closure. You can't sequelize catharsis. You can't sequelize a man's death and reunion with his family in the afterlife. And yet, Hollywood tried. That's the difference between runtime bloat and franchise bloat. Runtime bloat is when a movie stretches itself beyond what the story requires. Franchise bloat is when a studio stretches a story far beyond what the narrative can support. Gladiator 2 could have been 90 minutes or 190 minutes. It wouldn't have mattered. The problem wasn't the length. The problem was the premise. And this is exactly where the Hollywood Reporter article misses the forest for the trees. It treats runtime as a trend, as a statistic, as a neutral shift in filmmaking norms. But runtime isn't neutral. Runtime is a choice. Runtime is a statement. Runtime is a reflection of what Hollywood thinks audiences want, or what Hollywood wants audiences to accept. The article quotes Denis Villeneuve saying young people want meaningful long movies and uses Oppenheimer as the example, but it never asks the obvious follow-up. Do young people want long movies, or do they want good movies? Because those are not the same thing. Oppenheimer isn't successful because it's long. It's successful because it's compelling, because it's well written, because it's well acted, because it's well directed, because it has something to say. Length didn't make Oppenheimer good. Quality did. And that's the blind spot in the Hollywood Reporter article. It treats runtime as though it's a feature rather than a byproduct. It treats length as though it's inherently meaningful. It treats the success of a few long movies as proof that audiences crave length, rather than proof that audiences crave substance. The article never addresses ticket prices. It never addresses sunk cost psychology. It never addresses runtime fatigue. It never addresses the risk audiences feel when they see a 3-hour runtime attached to a movie they're not sure about. It never addresses the fact that long movies can fail, and fail hard. It never addresses the difference between a movie that earns its length and a movie that inflates itself to feel important. It never addresses the fact that Seven Samurai is the exception, not the rule. It never addresses the fact that the Ten Commandments is long because the story is long, not because the director wanted prestige. It never addresses the fact that Gladiator and Kingdom of Heaven earned their length through emotional maturity, not spectacle. It never addresses the fact that Peter Jackson's King Kong is long because Peter Jackson had just made The Lord of the Rings, not because the story demanded it. It never addresses the fact that audiences today are more selective, more cautious, and more overwhelmed than ever before. Instead, it treats runtime as though it's simply a matter of taste, as though audiences woke up one day and decided that movies under 2 hours were no longer worth their time. But the truth is much simpler. Long is fine if you earn it. Long is fine when the story demands it. Long is fine when the characters justify it. Long is fine when the themes support it. Long is fine when the pacing sustains it. Long is fine when the emotional payoff requires it. Long is not fine when it's padding, when it's bloat, when it's franchise setup, when it's ego, when it's marketing, when it's a substitute for substance. Hollywood has forgotten that length is not the same thing as depth. Length is not the same thing as meaning. Length is not the same thing as value. And audiences feel that. They feel it in their wallets. They feel it in their schedules. They feel it in their patience. They feel it in the way they choose which movies to see and which movies to skip. The real question isn't why movies are getting longer. The real question is, why aren't they getting better? Because the problem isn't runtime. The problem is wasted time. Audiences don't resent long movies. They resent movies that don't respect their time. They resent movies that stretch simple stories into 3-hour epics because the studio wants prestige. They resent movies that confuse scale with substance. They resent movies that drag when they should move, that wander when they should focus, that inflate when they should refine. And that's why the examples that work, Seven Samurai, The Ten Commandments, Gladiator, Kingdom of Heaven, stand out so sharply. They're long because they need to be long. They're long because the story demands it. They're long because the emotional weight requires it. They're long because the theme justifies it. They're long because they earn it. Hollywood can make long movies. Audiences will watch long movies, but only if the length serves the story. Not the marketing, not the director's ego, not the franchise roadmap, not the illusion of value. So yes, movies are getting longer. The Hollywood Reporter is right about that. But the real story isn't the runtime. The real story is the disconnect between what Hollywood thinks audiences want and what audiences actually respond to. Audiences don't want long movies. Audiences want good movies. And if Hollywood wants to keep making 3-hour films, that's fine. Just make them worth the time.